In the Soviet Union, Afghanistan had always been an important country. The nation's predecessor, the Russian Empire, had throughout the 1800s, a fierce rivalry with the English in that region, known as the Great Game. The main reasons for Afghanistan's importance were the following. First, it shared a frontier with the Soviet Union. Secondly, it had strategic access to potential warm water ports. And finally, it separated the superpower from the Islamic world, preventing the spread of Islamic extremism. In 1973, a coup took place in the Kingdom of Afghanistan. Former King Mohammad Zahir Shah was overthrown by his cousin, Mohammad Daud Khan. The Soviets supported the coup since they thought that the new leader would be a better ally than the former. But unfortunately for them, Daud Khan would be more anti-Soviet than expected. So on April 27 of 1978, a Marxist-Leninist party known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which had been plotting to seize power for some time, succeeded in a coup d'etat. They overthrew President Mohammad Daud Khan in an episode that came to be known as the Sour Revolution. And the new leader of Afghanistan was Nur Muhammad Taraki. Under him, the PDPA established unpopular laws, such as land and secularization reforms. This led to insurgent groups known as the Mujahideen rising up. They defended Islam, tribal customs, and conservative Afghan values. When Taraki was killed by his second-in-command, Hafizullah Amin, the Soviet Union became increasingly concerned about the PDPA's instability, who feared that the country would fall to Islamic insurgents, or even worse, align with the West. So to avoid that, in December of 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan. They also launched Operation Storm 333, which consisted in an assault on the Tajbek Palace, during which they assassinated Hafizullah Amin, who was then replaced by Babrak Karmal, a more loyal figure. This invasion marked a turning point in the relations between the US and the Soviets, as it led to the end of the détente and the beginning of a new era of confrontation. The US responded by supporting the Mujahideen, leading to a protracted and costly conflict for its rival. Indeed, President Jimmy Carter imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, like halting arms control negotiations and boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics. In that year, with the election of the anti-Soviet Ronald Reagan, the US reaffirmed its will to oppose the USSR since the country strongly supported anti-communism worldwide, such as in Afghanistan and in Nicaragua. In his speech, he labeled the opposing superpower as the evil empire. His administration significantly increased military spending and initiated the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was intended to be a defense missile system against ballistic nukes. And since parts of the program would be in space, it was often called Star Wars. But the weaponry required advanced technological systems that hadn't yet been developed. One such example were space-based lasers. The people who opposed this initiative said that the system was too expensive and uncertain. They believed that it could also lead to a preemptive Soviet attack if it thought that the US was capable of blocking nukes. It was also often considered in a violation of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. So for those reasons, the project would hinder arms talks for a while. But with that said, Reagan's SDI is sometimes credited with pressuring the Soviet Union economically and technologically, contributing to its eventual collapse in 1991. But the program would sadly be dissolved in 1993. To give a more detailed depiction of what happened during the Afghanistan invasion, well, right at the beginning of the conflict, the Soviet Union quickly took the capital and controlled a few key locations. But controlling the countryside of the nation was a completely different story. Over the next decade, guerrilla war raged across the country. The USSR controlled key routes and urban centers, while the militants held everything else. Their strategies also differed greatly, since while the Soviets often employed landmines and aerial bombings, the Mujahideen privileged using sabotage methods, such as damaging power lines, knocking out pipelines and radio stations, and much more. One of the reasons the war was so hard for the Soviets was that it was condemned internationally. This meant that there was substantial support for the Mujahideen by the US, like for example through Operation Cyclone, led by the CIA. Many foreign volunteer fighters known as Afghan Arabs also bolstered the Mujahideen ranks, with the most famous one being Osama bin Laden, which explains in part why this war contributed to the formation of future jihadist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In the end, the Soviet invasion, which was initially intended as a quick operation, turned into a decade-long quagmire with many undesired consequences. It left Afghanistan devastated and deeply fractured, with repercussions that reverberate to this day. The final tally of the conflict was between 1 and 3 million Afghans killed, which amounted to around 7.4 to 22.2% of their entire population. It also drained the USSR of resources and morale for over a decade, contributing in part to its collapse, which explains why the conflict is sometimes called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And finally, the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 1988 led to the First Afghan Civil War, which opposed the PDPA to the Mujahideen and still persists to this day. Now, going back to the end of the 1970s, a monumental transformation was reshaping its political landscape and social fabric. For the past 38 years, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had been the Shah of Iran. During his secular and authoritarian rule, he had maintained close ties with the United States and had embarked on an ambitious modernization campaign known as the White Revolution. This series of reforms aimed to rapidly industrialize Iran, expand women's rights, and implement land redistribution. The White Revolution was separated into 6 key themes, which you can see on the screen. These reforms disrupted traditional power structures and fueled resentment among landowners, the clergy, and more conservative segments of Iranian society. Tensions escalated and opposition to the Shah's regime grew. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been exiled, returned to Iran, invited by the government in an attempt to stabilize the country. Khomeini's arrival marked a turning point because it sparked a wave of support from millions who shared his vision of establishing an Islamic government. The Shah fled the country, marking the end of the Iran monarchy and the beginning of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This meant that overnight, the US lost one of its most consequential allies in the Middle East, as Khomeini severed ties with them and denounced the existence of Israel. As you can see, many Iranians viewed the US as complicit in supporting the Shah's oppressive regime and resented American influence in the nation's affairs. And in October 1979, due to his deteriorating health, the Shah sought medical treatment in the US. However, this wasn't inconsequential, as it encouraged the storming of the US embassy in Tehran by Iranian militants. In the process, 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage, with the aim of pressuring the US to extradite and judge the Shah, which heightened tensions between the two countries. This new Islamic nation was openly hostile to both the United States and the Soviet Union, and the Iranian Revolution would also lead to the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq War, beginning in 1980 and strongly affecting oil prices once again. By the end of the Iranian Revolution, Hezbollah, an Iran-backed group in Lebanon, still held American hostages that the Reagan administration wanted released. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, in Nicaragua, the US started supporting the Contra mostly through the CIA. They did this with the intent of weakening the Sandinista government, which was socialist and aligned with both the Cubans and the Soviets. They were also hoping to avoid the spread of communism to neighboring countries, which was reasonable considering that the Sandinistas actively supporting the Salvadoran Marxist guerrillas of the FMNLF, a Salvadoran political party and former guerrilla rebel group. Together, these two events would lead to one of the greatest political scandals in the US, the Iran-Contra affair. The US Congress was increasingly opposed to direct military aid to the Contras, and to enforce their will, they passed the Boland Amendment, which prohibited further US military assistance to the right-wing group. But despite the reform, some government officials continued backing the rebels. You see, there was a usable loophole in Boland 1. The US could provide funding to the Contras as long as the intention wasn't to topple the Sandinistas. So funds for human aid, for example, were absolutely acceptable. Realizing that nothing had changed in Nicaragua, Boland 2 was passed. But again, another loophole was found. The agreement didn't cover the National Security Council, meaning that its members, including Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, could continue covert operations that violated the law. Many attempts were made to finance the Contras, such as looking towards third parties like Saudi Arabia or Israel. But when this wasn't enough, a new strategy was established. The idea was to overcharge the Iranians for weapon sales and in exchange release some of the hostages, in the process using the benefits of the transactions to fund the Contra group behind the Congress's back. But do keep in mind that at the time, Iran was also entangled in the Iran-Iraq War and listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. In the end, in December of 1986, everything from the Contra affair was discovered by the press. But surprisingly, there seem to have been no direct consequences for President Reagan since he didn't face any legal repercussions, even though his administration's credibility was damaged.
I've done everything in my power to make all the facts concerning this matter known to the American people.
Now, to go back to a very uncommon theme that we haven't yet talked about too much, another missile crisis. Throughout the Cold War, the USSR and the USA possessed powerful long-range arsenals capable of reaching each other's territories. However, throughout the end of the 1970s, a huge shift had occurred. The Soviet Union had upset the balance of power by deploying SS-20 medium-range missiles that could reach not only the Middle East, but also Western Europe. Until then, the Soviet and US arsenals had effectively neutralized each other, maintaining a delicate balance of power. However, the introduction of Soviet medium-range missiles, capable of striking all of Europe, but not the United States, introduced a significant question. If these Euro missiles were used against European targets, would the US fire back? The real question then was whether the US, despite its obligations, would be willing to escalate into a full-scale nuclear exchange to defend Europe. So, to counteract what was seen as an instability, NATO promised and signed off on the installation of Pershing II missiles in Europe by 1983. In the meantime, it also attempted to engage in negotiations with the Soviets in the hopes of removing all missiles from Europe. This came to be known as the double-track decision. Peace talks on one track and the addition of missiles on the other if the talks wouldn't be able to lead to a peaceful agreement. And while all of this was taking place, protests erupted all across Europe. They were driven by public concern that US nukes in the continent would make it the primary battleground in a showdown between the two Cold War rivals. So to quell the population that was in fear, in 1981, President Ronald Reagan proposed the Zero Option, a bold initiative calling for the withdrawal of all Soviet and United States intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe. This concept, initially focused on reducing nuclear tensions in Europe, was later expanded to embody a broader vision: the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons worldwide. This vision laid the foundation for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which sought to significantly reduce the nuclear arsenals of both superpowers, marking another step towards global disarmament. 1 year later, in 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died. And from 1982 to 1985, 3 Soviet Union leaders succeeded themselves. The first was Yuri Andropov, who died and was then replaced by Konstantin Chernenko. He also died and was then replaced by the famous Mikhail Gorbachev, who made a few political moves in the Soviet Politburo. And as you can guess, these leadership changes didn't contribute to the stability of the USSR. Gorbachev also made some changes during his time in power, such as sidelining the hardliner Grigory Romanov and promoting the reformist Boris Yeltsin. Now, going back to arms stocks. By the beginning of the 1980s, it became clear that simply limiting the number of launchers was insufficient, as both the US and the Soviet Union continued to expand their arsenals within SALT's framework. So, to solve this problem, President Reagan initiated the START talks in 1982. The key idea? Rather than slowing down the growth of nuclear arsenals, they would have to reduce the overall number of them, and in doing so, hopefully leading to greater stability and less risk of an all-out nuclear war. He actually called the accords SALT III. And 1 year later, despite public backlash, NATO proceeded with the installation of nuclear weapons in Europe, a promise made during the double-check decision. This, combined with the Able Archer 83, a NATO military exercise which was conducted in November of 1983, almost accidentally set off nuclear war. The realistic nature of the drill, including live communications and troop movements, alarmed the Soviet Union. Believing it might be a cover for an actual nuclear strike, the USSR placed its forces on high alert, nearly triggering a catastrophic miscalculation. This incident clearly highlighted the fragile nature of the superpowers' relations and the ever-present risk of nuclear disaster during the Cold War. Taking into account the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan and the tensions between the two superpowers, we can understand why no real arms talks occurred from 1979 to the mid-1980s. They really only restarted when Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985. When he took charge, the nation was burdened by stagnation, economic inefficiency, and mounting political pressure. Indeed, growth under Brezhnev had gradually slowed, leading to what Gorbachev would call the era of stagnation. This led him to look for a compromise with the US. And to attempt to counteract this slow economic rise, he also introduced a few reforms based around 2 key concepts: Perestroika, or restructuring, and Glasnost, or openness. Introduced in 1985, Perestroika aimed to reform the Soviet economy. Gorbachev wanted to boost productivity, decentralize decision-making, and encourage individual responsibility. Glasnost was another major reform, since it allowed greater freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and transparency in government. As mentioned previously, the Soviet Union was beginning to struggle economically, mainly due to the oil price spikes in 1973 and 1979, triggered by OPEC countries' decisions to drastically cut oil production. The 1973 embargo, instigated by Middle Eastern producers during the Yom Kippur War, and the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which disrupted global oil supplies, cemented the OPEC's power over the global energy market. This prompted significant responses from non-OPEC countries like the United States, Canada, and Mexico. For example, there were many advances in drilling technology and exploration during this period, which spurred a surge in oil production from these nations. As the non-OPEC oil flooded the markets, tensions within the OPEC grew. So, by the mid-1980s, Saudi Arabia made a controversial decision to increase production to regain market share from its competitors, further destabilizing prices. Which explains why in 1986, they collapsed to nearly a third of their previous levels. This price drop sent shockwaves through economies who were heavily reliant on oil exports, such as Venezuela, Kuwait, and most notably, the Soviet Union. Indeed, it significantly eroded Soviet revenues, marking an even more severe economic downturn. But the financial havoc wasn't the only consequence of the oil glut, as it also contributed to political instability within the country. It complicated maintaining military presence and geopolitical ambitions for the Soviets as well. This crisis in oil revenue would later be recognized as one of the main factors that paved the way for its dissolution in 1991. In the same year, on the night of April 26, the tranquil silence of Pripyat was shattered by a deafening explosion. A sudden flash of blinding light lit up the dark sky as reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant erupted in an uncontrollable blaze, sending a massive plume of radioactive smoke into the atmosphere. It not only caused huge environmental and human suffering, and would later strongly undermine the Soviets' credibility, but also reinforced Gorbachev in his Glasnost and Perestroika reforms, as well as his belief in the need of cooperation with the West. As mutual trust was being built between Gorbachev and Reagan, the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which forbade a whole class of nuclear weapons, was signed. All 2,692 missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers were destroyed. Once again, the mutual political will for weapon reduction was obvious. There were a few conditions to the treaty though, most notably equality between the US and the Soviet Union, as well as verifiability. And the treaty also had to exclude both the British and French arms stocks. To conclude on this matter, it was thanks to President Reagan's zero option that the Euro missile crisis was almost completely solved. In the same year, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, now the first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party, had a big fallout. He was fired and shamed in what resembled a show trial, something for which he never forgave his mentor. In a 1988 speech to the United Nations, Gorbachev also promised not to pursue military intervention in socialist states. This was a breakaway from the Brezhnev Doctrine, which required invasion in order to maintain socialism in the Eastern Bloc. Gorbachev's approach came to be called the Sinatra Doctrine, named after the song My Way, because it allowed socialist states to follow their own paths and make decisions independently. So, to be coherent with the promise he made during his speech, the Soviet Union started pulling their troops out of Afghanistan and Angola, and stopped supporting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But it's important to note that they also did it because of the heavy losses they incurred and the fact that they failed to stabilize the communist governments. Other unintended consequences of Gorbachev's policies were a shortage of goods, a worsening economic crisis, and discontent among the people. This in turn led to nationalist and ethnic movements appearing in the Soviet republics. But there weren't only negative consequences, since the policies did reopen the door to arms talks. In the beginning of 1989, his policies encouraged citizens across Eastern Europe to ask for reforms and freedoms such as democracy, human rights, and independence from Soviet control. This episode came to be known as the 1989 revolutions, also referred to as the fall of communism. A decade earlier, Poland had obtained limited liberties and privileges, and among them was the right to form trade unions through the Gdansk Agreement. This led to the creation of Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa, an electrician. And as the movement gained huge traction, the Soviets cracked down and imposed martial law on the country. But despite these restrictions, the movement survived underground. This lasted until 1989, which brings us back to the current timeline. In the early months of that year, Solidarity leaders and the communist government held roundtable talks, during which they agreed to legalize the trade union as well as semi-free elections. This was the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe since World War II, and marked the beginning of the Eastern Bloc's collapse. Meanwhile, near the Hungarian border, Miklos Nemeth and Otto von Habsburg wanted to test Gorbachev's reaction to the opening of the Iron Curtain. Their idea was to open the border temporarily for a picnic, allowing Hungarians and Austrians to mingle freely, symbolizing a united Europe. This was tested in the city of Sopron, near the Hungarian-Austrian border. Both countries were granted permission to open the frontier for 3 hours, and hoping to escape East Germany, many attempted to use the picnic to do so, marking the event as one of the first cracks in the wall that split Europe so many years ago. Following Poland, Hungary initiated reforms as well. Miklos Nemeth's government opened Hungary's borders to Austria, which allowed East Germans to be able to break through the Iron Curtain and escape to West Germany. This also reinforced the suspicions that the communist bloc was falling apart, and by October 1989, Hungary had adopted a multi-party political system, ending the monopoly of the Communist Party and transitioning towards democracy. Protests also appeared all over East Germany, with the most famous being the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig. They were peaceful protests happening, as the name suggests, on Mondays that proved pivotal in maintaining public support. Hoping to attenuate the revolts, instructions were sent from Moscow, but there was a huge misunderstanding, and East German officials inaccurately mentioned that the people could now cross the border. On November 9, 1989, the air was thick with anticipation, as thousands gathered in East Berlin, hearts racing and spirits soaring. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had stood as a cold, unyielding barrier that divided families and stifled dreams. But that evening, everything changed. As the crowd heard the announcement, "The borders are open," this belief turned to exhilaration. With tears in their eyes, people surged towards the wall, their voices rising in a chorus of joy and defiance. As they climbed atop the concrete monstrosity, they began to chip away at it, each blow a declaration of freedom, each piece of rubble a testament to resilience. The barrier that had kept them apart for so long crumbled before their eyes, and the weight of history was lifted as East met West, in an explosion of hope and unity. That night, the joyous cries of the Germans echoed throughout the capital, forever marking that moment as a triumphant reclaiming of their lives. It was a night of liberation and the birth of a united Germany, a shining beacon of hope for all who dared to believe in a brighter future. Czechoslovakia also saw its own peaceful revolution, which was known as the Velvet Revolution. Back in 1968, the country had seen a period of reforms under Alexander Dubček, but the Soviet Union and former Warsaw Pact members intervened militarily in an episode known as the Prague Spring. On November 17 of 1989, a student demonstration took place in Prague to commemorate International Students' Day, but it quickly transformed into a massive protest against the communist regime, culminating in the resignation of the nation's leadership by the end of the year, as well as the end of the communist one-party state. And in June of 1990, the first democratic elections were held, and 2 years later, the country was peacefully divided into the Czech and the Slovak republics, in what is sometimes called the Velvet Divorce. For Romania, however, there wasn't anything peaceful about its uprising, since it was the bloodiest one of them all. The deeply unpopular dictator at the time attempted to suppress the protests with brutal force, but failed to overpower them. So, after numerous clashes with the military and weeks of unrest, he fled the country, but to no avail as he was recaptured, tried, and executed on Christmas Day. Bulgaria, on the other hand, obtained a peaceful transition as Todor Zhivkov was ousted in a peaceful coup. Another interesting episode also happened in 1989. Boris Yeltsin visited the United States, where he saw NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. But what marked him the most was his visit to a Randall's supermarket. In a symbolic moment, Yeltsin toured it and understood the stark contrast between life in the Soviet Union and in the West. It left a mark so big on his psyche that later on he even commented on the event. As independence movements spread like wildfire through the satellite states across Eastern Europe, they began appearing within the USSR itself as well. For example, in 1989, more than 2 million people lined up and held hands in the Baltic states. This human chain measured around 690 kilometers and showcased the quest for independence, which came to be known as the Baltic Way or the Baltic Chain. On the 11th of March of 1990, Lithuania was the first Soviet republic to declare independence. In the beginning, sanctions were imposed, but the army wasn't called. Gorbachev attempted appealing to the people of the Lithuanian SSR, hoping for local support, but to no avail. As we can recall, following his strong disagreements with Gorbachev, Yeltsin had been sidelined. But in 1990, he made a dramatic comeback. As the Soviet Union was facing growing political and economic turmoil, Yeltsin positioned himself as an anti-system figure. This led to his election as chairman of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest and most powerful of the Soviet republics. He would object to Soviet control more and more, marking a split between his government and the Soviet Unions. And finally, on the 12th of June, Russia also proclaimed independence through the Declaration of State Sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Yeltsin also continued to openly criticize Gorbachev's reforms as being too slow and insufficient. And in July of 1990, Yeltsin publicly resigned from the Communist Party during its 28th Congress, denouncing it as obsolete and corrupt. This resignation effectively severed his ties with the system he had once served and positioned himself as the most prominent political challenger to Gorbachev's leadership. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the decision to reunite Germany was also taken. You see, during the first months of 1990, East Germany had held free elections, of which the results strongly supported West German parties. The country was pushing for a reunification, but Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union needed reassurances, which is why the 2+4 talk negotiations took place in that year, resulting in the final settlement with respect to Germany. Its strange name comes from the fact that it includes the 2 German states and the 4 Allied powers of World War II, effectively replacing the 1945 Potsdam Agreement. The objective of this treaty was to address the political and security implications of a German reunification. The outcomes of the talks included full sovereignty and reunification of Germany, as well as the acceptance of its post-World War II frontiers. The country also committed to limit its army and to not develop nuclear weapons. But one of the more difficult questions with regards to the nation was if it should join NATO. Well, in the end, Germany eventually joined the military alliance, despite the Soviets' fear that it would spread to other Eastern Bloc countries. However, verbal reassurances were made that the alliance wouldn't expand, and a clause in the treaty guaranteed that no nuclear weapons would be placed in the country. Speaking of the North Atlantic Alliance, the Warsaw State members were actually beginning to distance themselves from Moscow. The Warsaw Pact's military activities effectively ceased after a summit in July of 1990, where member states agreed to terminate joint military operations. And on the 25th of February of 1991, in a meeting in Budapest, they officially signed the agreement to dissolve the alliance. Another sign that the Soviet Union was breaking down was the election of Boris Yeltsin as the first president of the RSFSR. This was a significant event because it gave him democratic legitimacy through a popular vote, which effectively strengthened his position. His election weakened Gorbachev's authority and the Soviet system even more, as it showed a shift towards more autonomy for Russia. So, we can safely affirm that Yeltsin's victory represented a major political turning point, which laid the foundation for Russia's eventual independence. In 1991, in an event known as the August Coup, hardline communists attempted to dispose of both Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They wanted to restore the Communist Party's central power, and were very wary of the new Union Treaty, which would spread power among the republics, but without completely dissolving the Union. And with all of that said, the coup allowed one person to shine: Yeltsin himself. He gave his famous speech outside the Russian White House on top of a tank and called to the public.
Поскольку телевидение не дает гражданам России в ночь с 18 на 19 августа 1991 года отстранен от власти законно избранный президент страны.
His defiance helped rally popular support for the democratic forces and ultimately led to the failure of the coup. This actually placed him as the face of reform, as a figurehead of resistance, and severely weakened Gorbachev's government. Following these events, the Ukraine Act of Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet on the 24th of August of 1991, thus confirming the total independence and sovereignty of the nation from that point onwards. Many republics followed its lead and announced their independence as well. And as a consequence, on the 8th of December of 1991, the three main republics of the Soviet Union signed the Belaveja Accords, ultimately dissolving the superpower. And after that, most ex-USSR countries followed up by signing the Alma-Ata Protocols, establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States. But all of the legal and administrative processes took a few more days to finalize, and finally, on the 12th of December of 1991, the Russian Federation officially became an independent state. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin, as the president of Russia, assumed leadership of the newly formed country. Gorbachev resigned on the 25th of December of 1991, and in his speech, he acknowledged the dissolution of the Soviet Union, officially sealing its fate.
I leave my post with concerns, but also with hope. I leave you with my belief in your wisdom. You are the inheritors of a great civilization, and it depends on every single one of you, so it gets reborn again and has happy and honorable life for us all. I want to thank from the bottom of my soul everyone who stood with me for this great and honorable duty. Of course, we could have avoided some mistakes. We could have made new stuff better. But I'm sure, as sooner or later, our common efforts will give fruit. Our people will live in a growing, prospering, democratic society. I wish you all the best.
So, the republics had already declared their independence, but it was Gorbachev's resignation that formally ended Soviet governance over them. The communist flag was removed from the Kremlin and replaced by the Russian one. And in the end, on the 26th of December of 1991, the Supreme Soviet voted to formally dissolve the Soviet Union. This marked the official end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the nation. And after that, the Russian Federation became the successor state to the USSR, with Yeltsin as its leader. And a little side note is that because of the role that he played in ending the Soviet Union's dominance of Eastern Europe, Gorbachev was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, making him the only Soviet leader to ever have gotten one. Since Russia was recognized as the USSR's primary successor, it inherited many of its treaties, its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and its status as a nuclear power. The other nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were transferred to Russia in exchange for security assurances such as respecting their territorial integrity and sovereignty. The newly formed nation also assumed obligations under key arms control agreements such as the START Treaty and the INF Treaty. And since the end of the Cold War, significant progress was made in reducing the global number of nuclear weapons, primarily through disarmament treaties such as those. So, to correctly sum up the Cold War, it was a period that spanned from World War II to the 1990s, where two blocs opposed each other centered around their respective superpowers and ideologies. As mentioned by Georges-Henri Soutou, the term Cold War is a misnomer, as there were actually armed conflicts and casualties, and a good part of them can in some way or another be linked to one or both of the superpowers. For example, one can mention among others the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and even the invasion of Afghanistan. This epoch was also marked by near-catastrophic events, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Euro Missile Crisis, an unreasonable buildup of nuclear weapons, and political intrigue. The conflict finally ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And even though most historians disagree on the importance of the factors that made the country collapse, a few elements are certain. For example, most of them agree that the nation's decline mainly started during Brezhnev's leadership. The key points that can be mentioned are supply chain and economic problems, such as the disproportionate amount that was used on developing nuclear weapons so as to match their rival, the resurgence of strong nationalistic tendencies that followed, and a sudden change of policy of no armed repercussions that led to the collapse of the bloc, thus reshaping the global geopolitical landscape. The Cold War's legacy still continues to influence global politics, economic systems, and international relations, and the divide between the two countries hasn't disappeared. So, in consequence, many regions experience the aftermath of proxy wars to this day. And to finish, our quote for the video. The Cold War is over, but Cold War thinking survives.